Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Another beautiful day in Nebraska. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Nebraska's smallest natural resources district, Tri-Basin NRD. I'll give you an overview of our district and talk to you a little bit about our water management work. Tri-Basin NRD located in South-Central Nebraska, headquartered in Holdridge. We are responsible for protecting the soil and water resources in Gosper, Phelps, and Kearney counties, and I'm supervised by a board of 13 elected directors. The district includes portions of the Platte-Republican and Little Blue River basins. You can see the basins depicted here, and the dashed line shows the divide between Platte and Republican and the Platte, Little Blue, and Republican basins. What does Tri-Basin do? Well, a variety of things. We plant trees and shrubs. We operate and create wildlife habitat. We operate 7 drainage improvement projects. We educate students and the public about natural resources conservation. We work with landowners providing cost share to help them implement conservation practices. We enforce state laws that prohibit the human-caused erosion damage, and enforce also laws that prohibit excessive irrigation runoff. And we protect groundwater. We protect it from contamination. We protect it from diminishment. And we protect streamflows to the extent they're dependent on groundwater. So those are the 3 prongs of groundwater management: groundwater quality, quantity, and what we call integrated management or conjunctive management. I'll start with groundwater quality, which was Tri-Basin's focus for many years. And we were the second NRD in the state to establish a groundwater quality management area. Groundwater quality management is divided between the state and natural resources districts. NRDs are responsible for non-point source contamination, and the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality deals with point source contamination. Need to elaborate a little bit on the meaning of those terms. There's a potential point source of contamination, multiple point sources. These are non-point sources, and that may seem a little counterintuitive, but when fertilizer is applied, it's applied across a crop field, across a large area, and therefore considered a non-point source. Here's a little trivia question for you today. This is the ultimate source point. I don't suppose anybody knows that person by their face, but really this man should be as well known as Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison. This is early 20th century German chemist Fritz Haber, and he developed the Haber-Bosch process for synthesizing nitrogen fertilizer from hydrogen and methane. And that really set the stage, enabled the green revolution that enables us to feed the world today. So nitrate-nitrogen is a contaminant of our groundwater, the primary contaminant that we deal with in Tri-Basin NRD. And the primary sources, as you saw, commercial fertilizer and manure. The EPA has set a 10 parts per million threshold for safe drinking water supplies. And the concern with nitrates in groundwater is primarily effects on very small children, something called blue baby syndrome, in which nitrogen displaces oxygen in the blood and can interfere with the intake of oxygen by small children. Also, people with compromised immune systems can be affected by nitrates in groundwater at high levels. There are other potential contaminants of groundwater. Basically, anything that can dissolve in water and move through soil is a potential contaminant. We have been on the lookout for herbicides, insecticides, other ag chemicals over the years. We have had some detections of the herbicide atrazine, but at very small levels. The EPA has an advisory level of 3 parts per billion, not million, but billion for atrazine. We have never detected it at levels that high. We've only detected very small traces of it. We have also seen over the years in isolated areas other industrial chemicals. Carbon tetrachloride is a common solvent that was used still is used, but in much more limited way than it was in the past, but that has been detected in certain areas. Our groundwater quality management scheme consists of 3 phases. First phase is for the entire district, and in that case we limit the timing of application of fertilizer. We want fertilizer to be applied as close to the time that the crop will use it, so the potential for leaching is limited. We also, as a service, provide annual free domestic water sampling and testing of domestic water supplies for rural residents so that they can be assured that their water supply is as safe as a city resident. Now, in any case, in a township, and I hope you know what a township is, it's simply a subdivision of a county, but that's the basis for our management scheme. But if average groundwater levels in any township in the district exceed 9 parts per million, then we advance that township to a second phase of regulation. And in that second phase, we continue the phase 1 controls. But we also require farmers to attend a class or a seminar, so to speak, a couple hours of seminar, to learn about best management practices for nitrogen management. There are also requirements for deep soil sampling and irrigation water sampling. The intent there is to make farmers aware of the amount of nitrates in their soil and water, which is essentially free fertilizer. It's something they need to give credit to as they make their fertilizer plans for the upcoming year's crop. So if nitrates don't decline by more than 1 part per million and get below that 9 parts per million threshold within 15 years, then we advance a township into phase 3 regulation. And in that case, we're much more restrictive in terms of fertilizer application. This is our map showing our scheme of management, the white of the entire district, the phase 1, and then the phase 2 and 3 areas. This has that management phase area overlaying on actual nitrate content of the groundwater, the average nitrate levels in the different townships within the district. Holdridge there in the middle, in case it's hard for you to read. Minden, the county seat of Kearney County, and then Elwood, the county seat of Gosper County. This shows changes in nitrate content. Green is good, red is bad, and the trend tends to be for nitrates to be at least stable and in many cases declining over time. And so we're hopeful that we have seen the peak levels of nitrates in our groundwater in this area anyway. And I'd like for the district to be able to take credit for dealing with that problem, but really it's the farmers in Tri-Basin NRD, very progressive farmers, very conservation-minded farmers who want to do the best thing for the environment. And one of the adaptations they've made over time is to change the way they irrigate. When irrigation began in my part of the state, this was the method that farmers used to get water out onto their field. It's called the open ditch, as the picture shows you. Water would be run into a ditch. The tubes there that are shown in that photograph called siphon tubes, you'd simply immerse them in the water, pull them out, and get water to run out into the rows, into the furrows. The problem with this method, very inefficient. As you can imagine, water seeping away out of the ditch. Water that is applied to the field then tends to over-irrigate the upper part of the field, under-irrigate the lower part of the field. The areas that are over-irrigated have the fertilizer dissolved into the water leaches, or the nitrates down below the crop root zone. Once the nitrogen is below the crop root zone, it's not available to the crop and eventually ends up in the groundwater supply. So this was the initial method of irrigation. That was largely displaced by the 1960s by gated pipe or gravity irrigation through gated pipe. And that's somewhat more efficient. You don't have the water losses in the dirt ditches, but still you're just simply running water down the furrows. Still have that problem of over-irrigation and leaching. So then in the 1960s, center pivots came along. Center pivots much more efficient, apply water much more uniformly, require less water to be applied overall, and they open up some new possibilities that I'll get to in a minute. Of course, some center pivots are more efficient than others. The latest irrigation practice, which is now starting to be applied fairly widely, is subsurface drip irrigation. In this situation, what you'd call, I suppose, hoses or lines, plastic lines, are buried in the soil, and water runs from a collector pipe, that white PVC pipe you see there in the ditch, into the small distribution lines. And then there are emitters, small holes in those lines that let the water seep out. So you're directly watering the roots of the plant. Subsurface drip irrigation requires very clean water. Because the emitters are very small holes, it doesn't take much to clog them up. And so fairly elaborate filtering systems are required to keep a subsurface drip system in operation. Subsurface drip and center pivots, though, in addition to allowing farmers to be more efficient and reduce the leaching resulting from their irrigation practices, also gave them another tool for applying fertilizer, and to apply fertilizer during the growing season. Before center pivots came along, farmers basically had to front load their crops, so to speak, with fertilizer. You'd apply the fertilizer before you planted the crop in some cases, and we tried to emphasize in the past, when gravity irrigation was more predominant, try to get the farmers to apply fertilizer shortly after they'd planted, or even after the crop had emerged, what we called side dress applications. And that still does occur to some degree. Some fertilizers put on as a starter to get a crop going. But now farmers have this option of fertigation, in which the nitrogen can be injected directly into the water, and the water then distributed with the fertilizer through the pivot system. Now, that does create potential for contamination, and so a number of safety devices are required, and Tri-Basin NRD, as all NRDs do, inspect these systems on a regular basis to make sure that the safety devices are in place and operating correctly, so that there won't be any contamination as a result of the use of the system. So that's quality management. Now let's talk a little bit about groundwater quantity management. And generally speaking, Tri-Basin NRD is very fortunate in that respect. I'll set the stage, talk to you a little bit about groundwater water law. And in Nebraska, both groundwater and surface water are owned by you and me, by the people, and administered and protected by the state. Landowners have the right to use groundwater for beneficial purposes, however, on their own land. And groundwater use is governed by a doctrine called correlative rights. In other words, everyone has an equal share in the supply, but they share in the shortage as well. Surface water is handled a little differently. Surface water is governed and regulated by the state of Nebraska directly through state government. And they use the prior appropriation doctrine, which is common in western states, where the oldest or more senior users have the first opportunity to use the supply, and to the extent more water is available, then it becomes available to junior users. Tri-Basin NRD, even though it is the smallest NRD in Nebraska, is fifth out of 23, I should say, in terms of irrigated acres. This is a very intensively irrigated portion of the state of Nebraska. What this map shows you is center pivot systems in Tri-Basin NRD. And this map's several years old, so it would be even more thickly populated now. There's nearly 4,000 center pivot systems in our 3 counties. Now you see they're relatively uniformly distributed across the district, except for this area in Gosper County, especially western and southern Gosper County. The reason for that is topography. And what this map depicts is suitability of land for irrigation. The southwestern portion of Gosper County is lush canyons, deeply eroded soils, and just simply too rough to irrigate, and for the most part is pasture land. You'll also see a broad strip here in northern Kearney and Phelps counties. That is not necessarily such rough ground, but it is our own mini sand hills. This is south of the Platte Valley, a range of sandy soils. Much of that is now irrigated and was enabled to be irrigated by center pivot systems. The downside of that is that the sandy soils are very susceptible to leaching, and so there is a potential groundwater quality issue with irrigating those types of soils. Generally speaking, though, Tri-Basin has some of the most fertile soils in the state. The Holdridge Silt Loam is Nebraska's official state soil and covers much of our 3 counties. So if you're going to manage groundwater, first of all, you have to know how much groundwater is being used, how much is being pumped out of the ground. That's accomplished by installing flow meters, putting meters on each well, each irrigation system. In Tri-Basin NRD, we were spurred to do that and required to do that by a settlement of a lawsuit between Kansas and Nebraska in the early 2000s in the Republican Basin portion of the district. And so all of our wells in that part of the district are now metered. And farmers report their water use to us. In addition, they report the type of irrigation system they use, the crops that they've grown. And this bar graph simply shows you the relative efficiencies of different irrigation methods. And so as you see, center pivots apply much less water than gravity, which is both the gated pipe and open ditch systems. The third column, or third set of columns here, referred to as combination, generally is a scenario in which a farmer has put a center pivot on a field, but a center pivot, of course, travels in a circle. Most fields are square. So in order to be able to irrigate the largest portion of that field, then they will also run gated pipe out to those corners and irrigate the corners with gravity. Overall average, as you can see, about 9.5 inches of irrigation water is needed on an average year. This map depicts irrigation over time. We required reporting starting in 2005, so this goes from 2005 to 2017. Our 2018 reports are in now, but we just haven't gotten all that data in a form that I could make a graph out of it. And as I mentioned, an average year, about 9.5 inches of irrigation water is applied, but of course, no year in Nebraska has average weather. And so the line graph, the dashed line, shows you growing season rainfall and the relationship that you would expect occurs, in which the higher the rainfall, the less irrigation water is needed. In addition to knowing how much water is pumped out of the ground, you need to know the levels of the water in the aquifer. And in Tri-Basin NRD, we've been very proactive in trying to keep track of the water table in our groundwater supplies. In fact, this is probably the most intensively measured groundwater aquifer, certainly in the state of Nebraska, if not in the entire United States. And this map shows our observation well network. We started out in the 1960s and 70s measuring water levels in irrigation wells, and we started a project back in 2004 to drill dedicated observation wells specifically for the purpose of measuring groundwater levels. And that's what this map shows. It doesn't show much in terms of sample points in the Platte Basin portion of the district, but what's not shown on this map are about 60 dedicated observation wells that are measured by Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. The Platte Basin portion of Tri-Basin NRD is their irrigated service area. And so they collect the data in the Platte Basin portion to a large degree and share that data with us. It's a mutual arrangement where we share data in our area. This is how you measure an irrigation well, measure the water levels in an irrigation well. Simply a tape measure with a weight attached to the bottom. You open an inspection port on the pump and drop that tape down until it hits water. Have a little chalk on the tape so you can see where the chalk gets wet, and that then is the depth to water. This is one of our dedicated observation wells. It's what we call a nested well. In much of the district, we have two groundwater formations. We have what is widely known the Ogallala Formation, hard rock aquifer. And then above that, in much of the district, are Pleistocene age gravels. And the Pleistocene gravels are much more transmissive and really a better reservoir for water. But we measure in these nested wells. We'll drill one borehole, and then we'll put two casings in. One casing will be screened in that lower Ogallala Formation. Then we'll put bentonite, impermeable clay layer in there in the borehole, and screen the other casing in the upper formation so we can track any differences in water levels in the two formations. So the dedicated observation wells have sensors in them. Those sensors take water level measurements twice a day. our old measurement process for irrigation wells, we were just taking water levels generally in the spring and the fall, outside of the irrigation season. But here we can keep a fairly continuous record of water levels throughout the year. Now, we do need to confirm the accuracy of the data loggers and sensors, and so my staff will go out quarterly. They'll download the data from the data loggers and then drop a tape down, take a water level measurement manually, and then compare that to what the sensors tell us, correct that or calibrate that if necessary. The end result is a map like this, much like a topographic map of the land surface. This is a map of the top of the aquifer, the top of the water table. Maybe a little easier to understand if you look at it like this. Again, as in a map I showed you earlier, this is the surface water divide. Rainfall that falls on this side of the divide goes to the Platte, on this side to the Republican, here to the Little Blue. There is also a groundwater divide, and that largely conforms to, so anyway, as I said, from the water level data, we can get a clearer picture of the direction of movement of groundwater within the district. This is a map the University of Nebraska produces every year, statewide map of groundwater levels. And here is Tri-Basin NRD in South-Central Nebraska. Kind of a blue pool, stands out from much of the rest of the state, often referred to as the groundwater mound. And this is a phenomenon that results from long-time application of large amounts of water that's been diverted out of the Platte River and run through the Central Public Power and Irrigation District system of canals. Now, the large canals that Central operates, some of them are lined with either concrete or a plastic membrane, but for the most part they are dirt ditches, and so large amounts of water can seep out of them, at least initially when they're first filled up until the soil gets saturated. And then also, of course, the farmers that are utilizing the canal system, they're applying that Platte River water as irrigation, and so that's a net gain to the groundwater supply. That's in addition to the rainfall that we have. I guess I should have mentioned that through most of the district, we do have an open system in the sense that water that falls on the land, water that's applied as irrigation, will seep down through the soil. There's no aquiclude. There's nothing that prevents water from reaching the aquifer. So it will recharge if you apply more water. Now, this map shows changes. It's actually a couple years old, but shows changes from what the Conservation and Survey Division refers to as a pre-development period, which generally speaking is the 1950s up to a more recent year. This map is a map that our district produced, and in this case we're using a baseline period, 1981 to 85. So as I was saying, in Tri-Basin NRD, we don't necessarily look at groundwater levels in comparison to that pre-development period. We're looking at a period in the 1980s, 1981 to 85, as our baseline period. That's what we compare current groundwater levels to as we consider the need for regulation. Now, I guess I should have pointed out blue is good, red is bad on a map like this. You see a red area there in northern Gosper County. This is the result of some work that Central Public Power and Irrigation District did back in the early 2000s to entirely line one of their smaller canal systems called the E67 system. That water has as its source Johnson Lake, if you're familiar with that. And in order to make that canal system more efficient, they lined all the canals and replaced the laterals with pipelines. And so we lost the benefit of all that seepage from that canal system. Fortunately, though, this is an area that has a pretty good saturated thickness, over 200 feet of saturated thickness of the aquifer. And remember, this map is showing you declines from the 1980s. By the 1980s, the central system had been in operation for 40 years already. And so these are declines from artificially high levels. So they're not really a particular concern to us. Southern Gosper County is a different story. And in that case, we again have declines 20, 25 feet. But this is not an area that's seen the benefits of seepage from the central canal system. This is not included or never was part of the groundwater mound, so to speak. This is also an area that does not have as great of an aquifer. It's not really a particularly heavily developed area. I think in one of the townships that I'm familiar with, there's only about 50 wells, whereas some of the townships around Holdridge may have 250 wells. But it's an area where the aquifer is much more sensitive to overpumping, and actually only as little as 50 feet of saturated thickness. And so we've undertaken some regulations to protect the water supply there. A broad area of small levels of declines in northern Kearney and Phelps counties. Again, not a great concern to us because they're declines from artificially high levels. In fact, in the 1980s and 1990s, the groundwater level was essentially at the surface in much of northern Kearney County. And farmers were unable to plant their crops in the spring because their soils were saturated. I mentioned our drainage improvement projects. Those drainage improvement projects were dug not necessarily to capture surface water runoff, but actually to stabilize the groundwater table below the crop root zone in many cases. A third area in eastern Kearney County, the small towns of Hartwell and Norman, that area, is much like southern Gosper County. Never has been part of the groundwater mound, hasn't seen the benefits of seepage from the central canal system, has a thinner aquifer, much more susceptible to overpumping. There's a map of saturated thickness. The darker the blue, the thicker the aquifer. As much as 350 feet of saturated thickness in northwest Gosper County, and in western Kearney, eastern Phelps County, another very thick aquifer. I'm going to show you a series of hydrographs, simply graphs of the water level data we've collected over the years. This is a well just west of the town of Bertrand in Phelps County. And you'll see sort of a sawtooth pattern there. This is an irrigation well that we've measured since 1977. And the pattern is such that water levels are highest in spring. Before the irrigation season, the aquifers had a chance to stabilize and refill those cones of depression created by irrigation wells. Then we took another measurement in the fall showing the response of the aquifer to irrigation and pumping. So you see, as I said, the higher levels in spring, the lower levels in fall. But in this well, a steady trend from the 70s up to about the year 2000 of increasing water levels. That is the impact of seepage from the central canal system and application of that Platte River water. It was a pretty severe drought in the early 2000s. And we thought at first that might be really the reason that water levels had kind of leveled off here in these years. But then that pattern persisted. And what we believe now is essentially the water-bearing formation is filled up in this area. There is just no more room to store water in those transmissive gravels in that part of the district. This is a graph of one of our dedicated observation wells, not nearly as long a period of time shown by this graph. I should have mentioned on the y-axis of all these graphs is a 2-foot elevation interval. So each one of these horizontal lines 2 feet. Same on this one. So this is much more zoomed in, so to speak, or much narrower scale. The blue line is the shallow screen or the upper formation, the Pleistocene gravels. The magenta or pink is the deeper Ogallala formation. In this situation, they move pretty well in tandem. So again, you see that sort of sawtooth effect of drawdown during the irrigation season, recovery, recharge, filling in of the cones of depression in the off season. You see also a lot of smaller movements of a few tenths of a feet. And really these are often daily movements. What that is generally is simply barometric pressure changes. And so well kind of acts like a barometer in that respect. This well, which is in southwest Phelps County, fairly steady over the period of record from 2006 or 2008, I believe, up to the present time. We don't really look at how far the aquifer drops. although that is of interest, and you can see the impact of the drought 2012 and 2013 here. But we really look more closely at the peaks. How well has the system rebounded after each irrigation season? And so these peaks had somewhat of a rising trend until 2012, declines during the drought, and more of a steady state since then. Another irrigation well, set of irrigation well measurements in eastern Kearney County. This, as I said, an area that has not seen the benefits of the groundwater mound, of the seepage from the canal system. These measurements started in 1966. Development of irrigation in that area caused decline in the groundwater table. Wet years in the 1980s saw it rebound. Another drought in the late 80s. Wet years again in the 1990s. Drought of the early 2000s. Rebound up to 2012. Something changed here, though. And in fact, in 2014, we had a relatively wet year, and in this particular vicinity of this well, terrible hailstorm. Crops got hailed out. The guys really did not irrigate. And this graph only goes to 2015, but the pattern since then, since 2012, has been fairly steadily downward. And we're concerned that maybe we've hit sort of a tipping point, a situation in which they're, even though not very heavily developed for irrigation, the aquifer really might not be able to sustain the current level of pumping. This is another dedicated observation well in that same vicinity, and you see a similar pattern. This is a well in close proximity to an irrigation well. We don't generally like to put our dedicated observation wells close to irrigation wells, but we can't necessarily control all the land around it either, and so farmer drilled an irrigation well after we drilled our observation well, and so that skews that measurement pretty drastically. This in southern Gosper County. This in the same township at much greater distance from any irrigation well, and so much steadier water level, groundwater table. The pink line here, though, is of interest. This is the elevation of the stream bed of Turkey Creek, which is just a few hundred feet to the west of this well. And this is intended to illustrate a relationship between groundwater and surface water. So you see here the groundwater table is higher than the elevation of the stream bed. That means it's a gaining stream. It's gaining groundwater into the stream flows. Maybe a little confusing graph here, but this is what my directors look at for regulatory purposes. 0 on the y-axis for any of these lines is the 1981 to 85 average. And so any townships whose water levels on average are above 0 are in good shape. Those which are below 0 are susceptible or of concern to us because water levels are below that baseline. This is for eastern Kearney County, the Little Blue Basin. We have no live streams. There are no surface water, no gaining streams to protect in this area. So we've given the irrigators a little more leeway. Water levels in that basin are allowed to decline 5 feet below the 1981-85 levels. In the Platte-Republican, our regulatory trigger point is right at the 1981-85 levels. But even given that additional leeway, we have had one township go into phase 2 controls because it's gone more than 5 feet below the 81-85 levels. And just last month, my board designated a second township. So there's our groundwater quantity management map. The entire district is in phase 1, and the main control there is no new irrigated acres. We do not allow development of additional irrigated acres in Tri-Basin NRD. In phase 2 areas, these two townships in eastern Kearney County and this one in southern Gosper, even though you can't develop new irrigated acres, you can move them around, generally speaking. And I'll talk about some restrictions on that. But in these phase 2 townships, you cannot move irrigated acres into those townships. You can move them around within the townships, take them out of the townships. You can't add to the irrigated acres in those areas. One township in southern Gosper County has had sustained declines, and so we put it in a phase 3 regulation, and in the phase 3 regulation, we limit pumping. Farmers have limitations on how much water they can pump. So that's groundwater quantity. Now integrated water resources management, and that's managing groundwater to protect stream flows. Talked about that a little bit already, but That was required as a result of LB 962, a bill passed in 2004. In our district, actually, it even precedes that by a number of years. There was a bill called LB 108 in 1996 that was really targeted toward the Republican Basin. LB 962 is more broadly applicable to the entire state, but the Republican Basin has long been a focus because Kansas has been concerned that Nebraska was overusing our portion of the supply allowed under the Republican River Compact. So we've had to make some changes to maintain compliance with the compact. And so we've developed what are called integrated management plans. We've worked jointly with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources to develop plans for the Platte and Republican basins. Our current Platte plan, their 10-year plans, is going to be revised this year. We're in the process of doing that already. In the Republican Basin, that plan runs through 2021. We're also working on a voluntary IMP. We're not required to do it, but we're working with Little Blue NRD in the state to develop a voluntary IMP for the Little Blue Basin. So here's where groundwater meets surface water. I'd mentioned Turkey Creek before. Here is a seep, and groundwater is bubbling to the surface, running off into Turkey Creek. Our regulatory actions to protect stream flows. All groundwater irrigated acres must be certified. I'd mentioned we don't allow additional development. We've also counted or located all the irrigated acres. And there's some criteria that landowners must meet to have a certified irrigated acre. You have to have some history of prior irrigation. I talked about transfers of certified acres. They are regulated. They must be approved by my board of directors. And there are some parameters, some limitations in which you can do that, particularly related to impacts to stream flows. We also regulate large commercial and industrial uses. And we have, as part of our IMPs, taken on the responsibility of offsetting the impacts of groundwater irrigation on stream flows. This sort of psychedelic looking map shows you a number of things. The dots are irrigation wells. And so you can see the density of irrigation well development over much of the district. The colors indicate impacts on stream flows. So reds, not surprisingly, along the Platte River, adjacent to the Platte River. You can imagine pumping a well close to the Platte River, you're going to impact the ability of groundwater to reach the stream. That holds true also for some of the tributaries of the Platte and tributaries, perennial tributaries of the Republican, streams that are flowing most of the year, if not year-round. In Tri-Basin NRD, we have portions of the Platte Basin that are considered over-appropriated. There is more water use than can be sustained over time. And then we have portions that are fully appropriated, where we have essentially a balance of water use and water supply. And in our Platte Basin IMP, we have requirements to, as I said, offset or make up for that impact of groundwater development. And that amounts to about 3,500 acre feet a year we have to get back to or restore to the river, the Platte River. In the Republican Basin, it's a little more complicated because we're dealing with something called imported water. In the Republican River Compact, the state has agreed to divide up with Kansas and Colorado what's called the native or virgin water supply of the basin, water that is inherently part of the Republican River Basin. But because of the groundwater mountain, and because of all that Platte River water that was diverted over the years, there is more groundwater moving to the Republican than there was in pre-development times. And so, as part of the compact, that's considered imported water. It's extra credit for Nebraska. It's really a way for Nebraska to make up for some use within the Republican River Basin. And so we need to try to protect that imported water. And the way we do that is through groundwater quantity management, which I discussed. We have to protect those groundwater levels, keep them at or above that 1981-85 baseline. We also regulate irrigated crop production through the certification process, and then we augment stream flows. This graph shows the compliance measure that we have in our IMP for the Republican Basin. The blue line is imported water going into the Republican tributaries. The red line is consumption of the water supply by irrigators in Tri-Basin. See the red line above the blue line on this graph? Well, the intent of our IMP is to keep the blue line above the red line. But you see also this graph only goes through 2013. This is an updated graph. Doesn't quite have that same relationship, does it? Well, no miracle occurred in between 2013 and 2014, but there was a Supreme Court decision in a second lawsuit between Kansas and Nebraska. And the headline grabbing result of that was Nebraska was required to pay damages to Kansas for overuse in the past of the Republican Basin water supply. I believe our damages were in the range of $5 million. What did not grab as much attention, however, was that Nebraska was able to convince the court that there were problems with the way water was accounted for in the Republican River Compact, and particularly in relation to my district. Our irrigators were shown to be irrigating using the imported water rather than the virgin water supply of the Republican Basin. And so that should not have been counted against Nebraska, so to speak. And with that correction in the accounting, that moved the lines. And so now we're in a balanced condition once again. Now, future forecasts indicate that we may have a problem on the horizon, that the use will remain pretty much constant. We're not developing any more irrigated land, but those imported water contributions may decline because the impact of stream flows of the current levels of use may increase over time. So we're doing some things to address that. And that's stream flow augmentation. Now, we could address this by simply reducing use. We could tell farmers, you cannot pump as much groundwater. We could put limits on their pumping. Or we could simply pay them not to irrigate. But we've chosen the path of augmentation. And there's either direct or indirect augmentation. Direct augmentation is fairly simple. You drill a well and you pump water into a stream. Or if you have a reservoir or some sort of surface water system, you just release more water. Indirect augmentation is something that we've done on a fairly wide scale, which is working with Central Public Power and Irrigation District in the state of Nebraska. We've paid Central to take excess flows out of the Platte and distribute it around our district, let that water seep away, provide extra recharge to the system. I mentioned the alternatives. We could, by rule and regulation, limit farmers pumping. And that wouldn't really cost the district much directly, but it would have a definite impact on the local economy. Or we could pay farmers not to irrigate, but the levels of irrigation that would have to be reduced would be such that we would be paying tens of millions of dollars to accomplish that, which we simply can't afford to do. Our tax base doesn't support that. And I probably should have mentioned at the outset, NRDs are primarily supported by local property taxes. We do get good support from the state of Nebraska, and we do get some federal dollars, but our primary source of revenue is local property taxes. So once again, we've chosen to do these augmentation projects to offset depletions. Oops. And I've talked about working with Central Public Power and Irrigation District. Over the years since 2006, we've diverted more than 100,000 acre-feet of water. We've put that into Elwood Reservoir near the town of Elwood. We've run it down what's called the E65 canal system, which is basically on the divide between the Platte and Republican basins. And so that provides benefits in terms of recharge to both basins. Central, while they're civic-minded as anyone is, they can't do this work for free. They do charge us to divert that water. That charge runs now between about $38 and $45 an acre-foot, depending on the water, where the water is delivered to. The state of Nebraska has helped us to pay that cost, and so with the state paying half the cost, it runs about $20 an acre-foot for the district. And when you're diverting large amounts of water, that does run into considerable dollars overall. Excess flows from the Platte are generally available outside the irrigation season and in the winter time. And so Central has adapted and learned to pump water in very cold conditions. And you see in that right-hand photograph their pumping system at Elwood Reservoir. As long as you can keep water moving, it doesn't freeze. But in cold conditions, especially like we have today, there can be problems. And in fact, I was just talking to some Central staff the other day, and they did have to turn off the pumps at Elwood to protect them from freezing up. This shows just simply diversions over time. On average, we'd like to be diverting about 8,000 acre feet, but once again, there's no such thing as average in Nebraska, weather-wise or water-wise, and so we take what we can get when we can get it. And in many years, we are not able to divert anything. In some years, we divert 15, 20, as many as 22,000 acre feet. We have other direct stream flow augmentation projects. In the Platte, we have one along North Dry Creek. North Dry Creek's a tributary of the Platte, enters the Platte just south of the town of Kearney. We have located a couple wells, just irrigation well-sized wells along that stream to pump water when it's needed to make up for those impacts of groundwater on surface water supplies. We, in fact, were the first district in Nebraska to have a stream flow augmentation project. Some of you may have heard of NCORP, much larger scale project, but we preceded them by a few years. Once again, the state through DNR helped us to pay that cost. Cost per acre foot really is pretty favorable, but that depends on the volume that you pump. The more water that you pump, the less cost per acre foot. We're working on an augmentation project in the Republican Basin as well, and we drilled our first observation well next to where we wanted an augmentation well. Therefore, we wanted to have a baseline before we actually started pumping, and our first production well was drilled over the winter of 2015-16. Not a real impressive sight, but there it is. Water simply just runs into the stream through an open channel. Second well is planned for probably this year. These wells pump about 1,200 gallons a minute. We anticipate that to the extent we need to, we can get about 1,000 acre feet a year out of those wells. Of course, they also have an impact on stream flows. At some point, it's sort of the snake eating its tail, and the benefits are reduced over time, but certainly as a short-term augmentation source, they're very useful. We've been working with Central, with the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, on a new project, and again had the assistance of the state to help pay to construct pipelines from the Central Canal system to a series of federally owned wetlands. And you see them depicted here. The largest of them, northeast of Holdridge, Funk Lagoon, Funk WPA. And this is, I like to think of just one of those great win-win situations that are also rare in life, that we're able to take excess flows out of the Platte, we're delivering those to the wetlands, we're creating migratory bird habitat, and then we're also providing groundwater recharge as that water seeps away. We were able to, and when I say we, really Central constructed the diversion to Funk Lagoon, and it was operated for the first time this fall. The other pipelines are going to be constructed hopefully by next spring, and we'll be able to deliver water to all 5 of these wetlands by fall of this year. This is the outlet structure for Funk Lagoon. This is while it was under construction, and so this piece is where water would come in, water goes out the top. This piece sits on top of that. There it is in operation. We put over 2,000 acre feet into Funk Lagoon in November and December of this past year. Finally, might be of interest to you what's called the Platte-Republican Diversion. This, if it is completed, would be the first time in Nebraska that we've taken water out of one river basin and put it into another. Although in the big picture, both the Platte and the Republicans are tributaries of the Missouri, so they're really sub-basins of the Missouri River. Anyway, the idea originally conceived by former Nebraska State Senator Mark Christensen. The concept had been out there for some time, but he was a great promoter of this. In 2015, we had some high flows. We had flood flows in the Platte, and so we were spurred to look very closely at what specifically opportunities might be available to us. And so working with Lower Republican NRD, our neighbors to the south, once again our partner Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District, we're looking at this project. This is a portion of the Central Canal system. I'd mentioned Elwood Reservoir. There's the town of Elwood. Holdridge is down here at the bottom right corner. This is the E65 canal that I've referred to. This essentially is Highway 23 between Holdridge and Elwood. At this point, just west of the little town of Smithfield, the E65 canal gets very close to Highway 23 on the north side. On the south side is the Republican Basin. The highway is essentially the divide between the Platte and Republican. Excuse me. So we looked at, just as an initial cut, a few tributaries of the Republican as possible conduits for diverting water from the Platte into the Republican. Water would be taken out through the Central Canal System. We looked initially at Spring Creek in Phelps County near the town of Bertrand, and then Turkey Creek, which I've already mentioned. Turkey Creek looks like the best opportunity to us at this point. Once again, here's Smithfield. The east branch of Turkey Creek is what we're focused on now. Oh, I should point out, okay, water diverted out of the E65 would run down a canyon, a lush canyon, into Turkey Creek, which eventually becomes a perennial stream, and then would enter the Republican River between the little towns of Edison and Oxford in Furnace County. Now, of course, because we're diverting into a dry canyon, a lot of that water is going to seep away, just like it does in the canal system. That's not a problem. That's groundwater recharge. That's a gain to us. And because it starts out as Platte River water, that is also imported water. That's also credit to Nebraska. We've done a feasibility study working with Olson and Associates, and that feasibility study is available at Tri-Basin's website if you're interested in it. And we looked at a couple different diversion rates. Estimates indicate we could divert up to 11,000 acre-feet into the Republican under certain circumstances. One concern, though, is potential for erosion when you're running water into a canyon that is developed as a result of erosion. So we've looked at pipelines and check dams to prevent that occurrence. We estimate cost of the project at about $1.8 million. Cost per acre foot depends a lot on how much you divert, how much central charges, number of factors, but at most would be about $80 an acre foot. And that really is a pretty competitive cost. And so we get a cost to benefit ratio, very positive, 3.4 to 1. That's the point in the canal system where water would be diverted. That's the canyon where it would be delivered. This diagram shows the elevations at the bottom of the canyon, very steep initially. And so we have to contain the water in a pipeline there for the first about 2/3 of a mile. Then the bottom of the canyon tends to not entirely level out, but gets to a lower grade. And so we're able, we think, to be able to run that water open in the ditch with a series of check dams to prevent erosion and head cutting. Final design and cost estimate are in process. We've applied for a water right in conjunction with Central. And once we learn whether we'll get the water right or not, then we'll start to seek easements from landowners for the project. We've been keeping them in the loop all along so that they're aware of what we have in mind. Construct the diversion, construct the pipelines, and check dams. If this one works out, I got another one in the hopper, potential Tri-Basin diversion north of the town of Minden in Kearney County. On this map, there's the Minden Airport. There's Highway 10. It's the very tail end of the Phelps Canal system. This very end of the Central Irrigation District project. There is a potential to be able to divert water out of the Phelps Canal into Sand Creek, which is a tributary of the Little Blue. I mentioned we've had these groundwater declines in eastern Kearney County. This would be a way to address that. But one thing at a time. We're going to try the Platte-Republican diversion first. So with that, I appreciate your attention. Are there any questions?
Great. I really enjoyed the talk. Just a question about your strategies for reducing water. You talked about taking reducing irrigation, paying farmers for that, as well as augmentation. Could you talk a little bit about the role of maybe cost-sharing technology and trying to reduce applied irrigation by investing in cost share and training for some of these precision technologies that are coming out?
Sure. And technology has really done a lot in terms of helping our farmers become more efficient. technology like center pivots and now automation of center pivot systems. A lot of farmers are able to control their center pivots from their phones. And monitoring, measurement of water content in the soil so that farmers can make more knowledgeable decisions about when they need to irrigate. That helps reduce the over-irrigation, certainly. A lot of farmers' irrigation scheduling practices initially was, well, what's my neighbor doing? Well, now they're able to make more objective decisions about whether their crop needs water. And yes, we provided some cost share dollars. We provided some incentives for farmers to do that. Really, the federal government's played a much larger role in that. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has been instrumental in helping farmers to become more efficient in their irrigation. And farmers themselves, just, they want to be progressive. They recognize that there are savings both in terms of water, but also in terms of cost. There is no free lunch. It costs to pump water. And so they want to reduce those operating costs and become more efficient. Does that address your question? Yeah.
Does your cost-benefit ratio that you guys have calculated include potential impacts of introducing invasive species, pathogens, viruses from one basin to another, and potential impacts on the upper end of Harlan County Reservoir and potential of getting invasive species into that reservoir and impacts on recreation of that reservoir?
Yeah, well, that's a concern we're very sensitive to. Asian carp is a species, an invasive fish that's been found in the Platte River system. Been found around the town of Kearney and even upstream from there to some distance. But the Central Public Power and Irrigation System diverts much further upstream near the town of North Platte. And Central's irrigation system and delivery system, their supply canal, is monitored closely by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Johnson Lake, Elwood Reservoir are both fisheries that are important to Nebraskans, and so Game and Parks Commission is on the lookout for these invasive fish. There is, I suppose, the potential that under some circumstances, if those fish get in the canal system, which they are not now, if they get into the reservoirs, they could then, in diversion into the Republican, be spread. There are ways to address that. There are fish screens, there's sonic devices that have proven successful against Asian carp. Other invasives, well, really there's certain pathogens that, you just can't effectively prevent. But a lot of these invasive species, the primary mode that they get spread is generally in bait buckets, in live wells. That really is something that the Game and Parks Commission has to address. We really have no control over that. And that potential, in my mind, is and should be a much greater concern to fishermen and to the Game and Parks Commission. We'll do all we can to prevent the spread of invasive species. We've always been proactive in addressing Phragmites and purple loosestrife and a lot of these invasive plants, and we'll do what we can to prevent the spread of invasive animals and fish and mussels and all those things. We certainly don't discount that potential, and we'll want to work with the Game and Parks Commission to make sure that doesn't happen as a result of our project.
Hey, John. Are you seeing a decrease in the amount of nitrate in groundwater with the more efficient irrigation methods?
I didn't catch the first part of the question. Could you restate it, please?
Are you seeing a decrease in nitrates in groundwater with an increase in efficiency of irrigation?
Okay. Certainly that is our expectation. The problem is the vadose zone over much of the district is 80 to 120 feet thick, and so water moves very slowly from the land surface down through that column of soil to the water table, and nitrates from the 40s and 50s are probably still moving through the system to some extent. It's difficult to trace that accurately. Now, in the Platte Valley, where the water table is 5 to 10 feet, there you see a little more ready response, and you have sandier soils there. And it's been pretty apparent that during wetter years, and especially when you get a heavy rain in the springtime after some fertilizer's been applied, you see a spike in nitrate. And then you get a dry year or a series of dry years, get a drought, and more irrigation water gets applied. A lot of the nitrates in the irrigation water get scavenged out, and the nitrates go down in the Platte Valley. That's a much more responsive system. And so, yeah, it certainly is our expectation that increasing irrigation efficiency, it just stands to reason, reduces leaching and will help us to limit the potential for nitrate contamination. But it's a long-term process, and we hope we've seen the peak and have managed to bend that curve and level things off.
So I have two questions. My first one is on the Platte-Republican Diversion. What's the likelihood of you seeing that project being a go and actually being executed? And then have you guys assessed any of the factors or impacts that might occur long-term? So I know you talked about stream augmentation being more of a short-term resolution. Do you see this being a long-term solution to stuff, or do you know any long-term impacts that might occur?
The short answer is it's complicated. And as far as the potential opportunities of the project going forward, to some degree it's out of our hands now. Technically it's very possible. It's doable. It's cost effective. But there are a lot of legal hoops we have to go through. As I said, we've applied for a water right. Well, when we applied for that water right, a number of people and groups objected to that application. And so we're still in the process of doing legal filings and haven't even really had a review of this water right application by the state yet. In fact, we're making our final filing tomorrow, and after that it should be in the hands of the state. But these objectors will no doubt pursue a number of avenues to try to prevent us from getting the water right in the first place. I will be optimistic and hope that we're able to make our case and get the water right. If we are, we have already said as part of our application, we will be last in line. To the extent there is a need for water for projects in the Platte Basin, they will be given priority, even if we get our water right. So we really only want to take water that nobody else has a need for, no other water users need. So all water rights have to be satisfied, all endangered species target flows have to be met before we would even have the opportunity to take water. Then there are other needs for excess flows. I mentioned, we divert excess flows for a number of reasons: groundwater recharge, offsetting depletions in the Platte. Other NRDs do that as well. And so there's a fairly narrow window of opportunity to actually use our project. But once it's constructed, yeah, we think it would have a 50 to 75 year lifespan. And those benefits should pay off the cost of the project, especially when you consider the alternative that farmers would have to either limit or stop irrigation, which would have drastic effects on our economy. This project would pay for itself in economic terms fairly quickly. Other questions?
When you use the term excess flows, you're talking about the flows that are above the Fish and Wildlife Service target flows, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so not in a sense of ecosystem service excess flows, it's those targets which the Fish and Wildlife Service have established.
That's correct. I mean, there are certainly a variety of opinions about whether there is any excess water in the Platte, but in legal terms, those are the flows we're required to protect, those Fish and Wildlife Service targets for the endangered species, and existing water rights as well. So that's the limitation that we are forced to deal with. It's my belief that the Platte River system has been altered so much over time that it's a different ecosystem than it was 100 years ago. And so the ability to restore those natural mechanisms of channel formation and maintenance, I think, is limited. And, well, we will see the effect of, we have seen the effect of high flows and flood flows in the Platte, and really it hasn't been what was anticipated by some biologists. The expectation was that it would scour out the vegetation and widen out the channels. In fact, it has tended to channelize the river even more, narrow and deep in the channels. But anyway, those are things that are really kind of beyond the scope of our analysis, and we're just looking at the Fish and Wildlife target flows.
Thanks for talking, John. Could you explain the timing of your augmentation wells for like Dry Creek? And do they mimic in-core timing in the wintertime to reduce groundwater recharge?
Well, we certainly would have that ability, and we would consult with the state and be glad to work with entities like the Game and Parks Commission to decide when's the best time to put water in the river. Now, of course, the compact's a constraint, and sometimes you just have to put water in when Kansas needs it. But sure, we could look at putting water in the spring when you'd have more flows in the stream, or in the fall when the stream is in danger of drying up, whatever would be most effective. We're open to those options. We have and will continue to try to avoid pumping during irrigation season simply because we don't want to interfere with surrounding irrigation wells. But yeah, we have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of timing of water pumping from our augmentation wells, particularly in the Platte where we don't have the compact issues.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to call it for the day. But if you still have questions for John, please feel free to come up and we can answer them afterwards. I want to thank all of you for coming and thank John for braving the weather. And let's give him one last thank you.